to an interview of Lyle Brooks, who has kindly agreed to be part of the Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital Oral History Project. Lyle is the grandson of Naomi Ginsberg, who was hospitalized at Greystone Hospital twice for a total of 5 years. He is also the nephew of Allen Ginsberg, one of America's most acclaimed contemporary poets. Naomi's hospitalization at Greystone and other psychiatric hospitals was immortalized in Allen Ginsberg's epic poem Kaddish. Although Naomi died before Lyle was born, her mental health condition played a large role in the family history, which Lyle will speak about. My name is Stephanie Kipp, and I am the Oral History Project Manager. I am serving as Lyle's interviewer, and we are meeting in New York City on February 9th, 2020. Ganesh Gopal is serving as our videographer. We are taping in a public space, and my apologies in advance for any background noise. First, some background on Naomi Ginsberg. Naomi Levy was born on 1896, immigrated from Russia, and married Louis Ginsberg in 1919. The family lived in Paterson, New Jersey, and Louis Ginsberg was a recognized poet and teacher. During the first year of their marriage, Naomi had a mental breakdown. In 1921, her son Eugene was born. Eugene is Lyle Brooks' father. In 1926, her son Allen was born. Naomi suffered from paranoid delusions, which included believing that the president had installed listening devices in her home. In 1935, she was admitted to Greystone Psychiatric Hospital and remained there until 1939. During that time, she had 40 insulin shock treatments. Naomi returned home, and by the winter of 1941, she had decompensated. She was initially admitted to a private psychiatric institution in Lakewood, New Jersey, but when her husband was no longer able to afford the facility, she was transferred to Greystone, where she remained for 2 years. Naomi and Louis divorced in the mid-1940s, and she moved in with her sister, where she began painting and writing. She spent her last years at Pilgrim State Psychiatric Hospital in Long Island. In 1948, after a lot of hesitation, her son Allen, who had become one of America's most prominent poets, signed permission papers for his mother to have a lobotomy. The surgery was not successful, and Allen expressed regret for the rest of his life. Naomi wrote her sons, asking them to take her home from Pilgrim State Hospital. She died there on June 9th, 1956, and was buried on Long Island near her son Eugene's home. At the time of her death, her son Allen was in California and unable to come to her funeral. Also, the traditional Jewish ritual of saying Kaddish prayers for the dead did not take place. After 3 years of reflecting on his mother's death, Allen wrote his epic poem Kaddish. Excerpts of the poem, which specifically refer to Naomi's years at Greystone Hospital, can be heard at the end of this interview. Jerry Hurley, actor and member of the Bergen County Players, is the poem's reader. After the poem's excerpts are read, website readers can also view a short video of Naomi and Allen Ginsberg at Pilgrim State Hospital. The video was taken 1 month before her death, when she met her first grandson, Allen, who was recently born. Lyle, can you please give us a little background on your family prior to your grandmother, Naomi, being hospitalized at Greystone?
Thank you, Stephanie. Well, starting with Naomi's side of the family, as you said, they came to America turn of the century. It was 1905. Her father was Mendel Livergant. Originally, his name was changed to Morris Levy. When he came to Ellis Island, his wife was Judith. Judith died of influenza in 1918. When they came here, originally he was selling Singer sewing machines. They later opened a candy and ice cream store not far from where we are right now on Orchard Street. And as far as I know, I've never been able to track down the exact date, but Morris died sometime in the mid-1930s. On my father's side, His parents were Pincus and Rebecca Ginsberg. They came over a little earlier. Rebecca's family came over, I believe, in the 1870s. Lewis is in the 1880s. As a consequence, Lewis was born in America, in Newark, in 1895. His father was in the laundry business and later ran a tobacco shop. Lewis and Naomi met in, I forget if you covered this, but in high school, Barrington High School in New Jersey in 1912, when I guess he was 17 and she was 16. And they were married in 1919. As I understand it, actually, she had her first breakdown not after their marriage. It was slightly before they were married. And at the time, it was not known that she had paranoid schizophrenia. She was diagnosed with that, I think, in the early 1930s. It was hypersensitivity to light. As a consequence, she spent a lot of time in a darkened room, but it was clearly some kind of mental illness or some kind of, they weren't quite sure. It wasn't diagnosed as schizophrenia, but her, she did have outbursts at a certain point. They were constantly having quarrels, part of it over money, partly over politics. Lewis's family was socialist. Her family was more aligned with communists, so there were a lot of fights over that, which increased as both the divisions between those two philosophies began manifesting themselves around World War II and as her mental illness progressed.
They also had some common interests, and were they vegan, and did they go to...
Veganism, well, she was interested in nudism. Lewis was not interested in that. I do remember my father telling me, as I recall, although now I don't know if my memory is correct, that she took him to a nudist camp. I know that she, at least on one occasion, with Lewis, I believe, went to a Marxist nudist camp. And she also practiced nudism around the house, which is also subject of some verses in my uncle's poem Kaddish.
Okay. So I think you covered the question of why Naomi was admitted to Greystone. Go ahead.
Yes. She did finally, receive a diagnosis. It had a different name than paranoid schizophrenia. I forget the exact name. But she had originally been in Bloomingdale's institution, not the department store. It was a mental institution. I don't know what her shopping habits were. But he was in debt to Bloomingdale's about $3,600, which was his salary basically back then. He was a school teacher. And Bloomingdale was a private institution, and Greystone was state funded, so that's all he could manage. And that was another reason he went there, but obviously she had a much more serious mental breakdown in the mid-30s that was clearly not merely related to light sensitivity. She was hearing voices, she was singing, she was having paranoid delusions that people, particularly her mother-in-law, with whom she did not have a good relationship, was trying to kill her. Ultimately, she thought Allen was a spy, and one of the most dramatic scenes in Howl is one episode where she insists on enlisting Allen to help her escape, and they take a bus ride to Lakewood, New Jersey, and end up in a pharmacy where she's demanding to have a blood transfusion, and she's surrounded by cops, and she's taken off, I believe, to Greystone at that point. I'm not sure if she was at some intermediate facility then, but certainly by night. I think she had a 3-year stay in Greystone from around 36 to 39. I'm not sure of the exact dates of the others, though.
Do you know if anybody visited her in Greystone?
My grandfather would take Allen and my father to see her, I believe, every weekend. I think the visits decreased in frequency as the years went on. My father went to college in 1937. My uncle went to college, I guess, around 42 or so. And he was also a student in high school, so they could always manage it. It was, I think, a 2-hour ride. But they saw her frequently enough. Toward the end, my uncle was traveling around the world, and my father was... he got married in the early 50s, and he ultimately had 5 children, so he was tending to both his law practice and his fatherhood. But quite frankly, I don't know how often he visited her between the late 40s and 1956. We do have that one memorialization in the video that somehow survived all this time. I don't think actually that they brought my oldest brother, rather, Alan, to see him. He was born on May 19th, 1956. She died on June 9th. I reread Naomi's letter to Alan, and she says that something like they were up to visit me. They have a new son who I assume is born by now. So I think they did not bring my brother with him. I think he was simply probably with a babysitter or another relative when they came up. Because he's not in that video, as I recall.
Well, that explains why when I was looking at the video, I kept looking for a baby, and I saw something in somebody's arms. I don't know, maybe it was a coat or something.
He may have been, he may have been nearby, because later in the video, there are plenty of shots of him being carried by my mom.
Okay.
They may have brought somebody up. I believe Edith. They showed that was my grandfather, Lewis's second wife, who he married in 1950. I think she's in the video. They show her online in the cafeteria. I imagine she came along and may have been holding my brother.
By the way, did Edith meet your grandmother, your father's first wife?
Oh, I
you don't know?
Well, no, she was they met in, I think, 47.
Lewis and
Lewis
Edith.
and Edith, yeah. They were introduced by a mutual
All right,
friend.
your grandparents were already divorced, and so your grandfather married Edith.
I can't. Well, I don't know. I don't know because they were married on March 25th, 1950, and I read somewhere that was by then his divorce was finalized. So I don't know what the process was for divorces in New Jersey or New York, or what the process would be if you had an incapacitated person. You know, I would tend to say no. I don't think he would bring her up to visit.
Did your family talk about your grandmother's mental illness?
Well, yes and no. I mean, by reading Kaddish is sort of talking about her. And my father wrote a poem about her. There's actually a play on Broadway in 1972, Kaddish, based on it, for which I actually have a review of it. It was very favorably reviewed by the New York Times, and my father wrote 2 scenes for that, and I do remember going to that. But I have to say that no, there wasn't a lot of sort of family conversation about her for a number of reasons. Firstly, my mother was the daughter of Methodist ministers. Our house bordered on a Methodist church where she sang in the choir for 50 years. We went to Sunday school, and we were somewhat sheltered, at least through the 60s and most of the 70s, from my uncle's life and what was going on. I mean, we knew who he was. I had some sense that he was famous, but there's some general awareness of what he was doing. My grandmother had been dead for several years, and it simply would not be a topic that they would introduce. I think it was partly because I was very close to my step-grandmother. She was a very lively, engaging, humorous woman, and I never thought of her as anything but my grandmother. I have no idea when I realized that she was not my biological grandmother, and it didn't make any difference because I never met the other one, and I didn't have a great deal of curiosity, actually, growing up. I think in high school they enlisted me to do a family tree, and I can still see it very sloppy. It didn't go back very far, but I can tell from it that I was not really fascinated with the subject, and so no, and I mean, what would they say? It's not something you would tell, 5, 10-year-olds.
Please tell us about your grandmother's last years at Pilgrim State Psychiatric Hospital, and if you know anything about her lobotomy.
Well, I know that Allen authorized that. I was actually surprised to find that, because I assumed that my father had, simply because he was more around in the area. My uncle was sort of a world traveler at that point. I think the frequency of their visits had dropped off significantly. I know that Allen describes the surroundings as being very dismal, and her being very sort of haggard and drawn looking, and I guess she lost quite a bit of weight. Although, if you read the only surviving letter I've seen was written to Allen a few days before she died, postmarked after she died. And when you read it, she seems, it's very literate. There's no typos, no grammatical mistakes. It reminds me of the writing style of my grandfather, where he kind of jumped from topic to topic in a very cheerful manner, throw in a question, throw in an observation. And reading it, you wouldn't have any hint that she was seriously mentally ill, much less lobotomized. I'm not really, it's difficult to say what her mental state was. If you look at the video, she seems to be clowning around and happy. But, obviously what you act like when you're on camera and, for a few seconds isn't that representative of your entire life and your entire being, particularly when your days are spent inside of a mental institution. She
was buried in West Babylon, Long Island. Is that right?
I'm a little confused about. I think it's West Babylon.
Okay.
The town. There are all sorts of overlapping towns out there. It's not far from where I live, and I have a brother who's out in a home in Farmingdale, which is maybe a 10-minute drive. So I've been there quite frequently. One of the reasons, I think this may be something you'll be getting to later, but one of the reasons he wrote Kaddish was that there weren't enough. You have to have a minyan. I think it's 10 men to be present to give the Kaddish, which is the eulogy basically for the dead in Jewish culture, and there weren't enough to do it, but they went ahead and did it anyway. There's a handful of mourners. My uncle was somewhere else, and he felt bad that he could not be here. He was out, I believe, in California at the time, and he felt guilty that he could not. She didn't have a proper Kaddish at the time, so it was partly guilt of being away, and the fact that she did not, have a proper Jewish ceremony. Although that said, my father's family was not particularly religious; they were culturally Jewish. My grandfather was an agnostic, and he openly would say that when we went there for, Passover Seders, and we would. Just about every weekend from late 60s, mid-60s, maybe from the early 60s to mid-70s, we would go there once a month, and we'd have dinner, and there'd be gefilte fish and all that sort of stuff, horseradish, but it wasn't, they were not Orthodox Jewish. They were very agnostic. They were socialist, communist, which generally involves a rejection of religion. One reason that I was brought up Methodist and went to Sunday schools, my father felt he'd missed something by not having some kind of religious schooling, and so he wanted us to be brought up with some kind of faith.
Do you think the lack of traditional burial was based purely on logistics, or was there any sense of, well, she's an older woman, a former mental patient, let's knock ourselves out to make sure she has all of the traditional rites and rituals?
Possibly, I think. It might have been logistics. Travel in 1956 isn't what it is now. I don't think you could just hop on a plane in Jewish. I think you have to be buried within a day or two. In my family, my side of the family, somebody dies, we have a memorial, 8 months later when we all gather down south. You bury them before that, but generally I think they have to have the ceremony within a day or two. So simply gathering everybody together. I think they had relatives in California. There aren't that many relatives on my father's side. I'm trying to think, let me see. There's Lewis. I guess, there might be 10 or so husbands and wives. I think you have to have men, though, for it, so I don't know. I quite frankly, I don't know what the requirements are on how you gather people together, whether they have to be related, whether you could just raid a synagogue and drag somebody there. I don't know.
Tell us a little bit about your father's poetry, and then perhaps you can read us the poem that part of it is on your grandmother's tombstone.
My father, my grandfather was a fairly prominent poet in the 20s and 30s. And my father also wrote some poetry. And they thought he was going to be the poet of the family. He taught high school for English in high school for a year, did not like it. But when he went into the Army in 42, he would send poems overseas to my grandfather. My grandfather apparently had some influence, and they would appear on the editorial page of the New York Times by Private Eugene Ginsberg. He was still known as that. He didn't change his name until around 1945. And so every few months you would see a poem, by Eugene Ginsberg, and I guess they thought when he got out, he was going to continue that. He did continue writing poems throughout his life, and in 1973 he self-published, I think, 500 copies of this. It's writes a passage with an introduction by Allen and his grandfather. So it's a fairly, it's 115 pages. It's a fairly large volume, at least for poetry. And he would give readings of it throughout the 60s, mostly in the 70s and up through the 90s with my uncle. They did some at Columbia. They did some out at Mole on Long Island, a few in Patterson. But his poems were much more like my grandfather's. They were rhyme verse. Generally every other line rhymed, or at least the second and last lines with rhymes.
And there was a poem in there about you playing piano, right?
Yes, metronome. That's,
okay.
Unfortunately, I'm not memorialized in my uncle's poems, except at one of his last poems he talks about his 5 nephews, which is an insult to my sister. It should have been 4 nephews and a niece, but that's poetic license. I guess you don't want to. I guess maybe. I don't know. Maybe nephew used to be the generic word like we talk about man or he or she is the default pronoun, but which is politically correct. Well, my uncle's not politically correct. I don't know why he didn't make up a pronoun, an obscene pronoun of some sort. Although my oldest brother is actually he's not mentioned by name. He just mentioned as my oldest nephew in one of the poems in the 1970s. We're talking about him as a teen and visiting my grandfather as he was dying. I think the poem is Don't Grow Old, if you want to look at that.
Okay, so can you read us the poem that your father wrote?
Yes, and this poem, it's to my mother. And
that's the name of the poem.
Yes, the poem is called To My Mother, and my father thought it would be the Kaddish. He thought this was, a beautiful tribute to his mother, and but once he saw my uncle's poem 3 years later, he realized that he was outclassed and went back to his law practice and figured, to my mother. Her spirit offended by insolence of slums, besieged by truth, her eyes continually sad. No wonder, encircled by the great wreckage of beauty, she mutinied, raging at evil, became quite mad. How terribly it hurt to disengage from life, to turn her lips from love forever away. Was there a fleeting time at a crossing of paths when she wavered, drew back, her heart a doe at bay? Then the choice was made. I can see her still, her face walled in by shadows, her eyes undone, watching from barred windows, the hours passing like clouds. All powers of love now guide her to the sun. And that last line, now, all powers of love now guide her to the sun. It's the inscription on her tombstone. And they realized 3 years later that Hal would not fit unless they, have to be continued on another one, so they left it as it was.
Okay. How was Kaddish received?
Kaddish wouldn't fit. Kaddish, well, obviously Howell was his big poem. Mm-hmm. That's what made him famous in the 50s.
Was that what he got arrested for also?
That's what. Yes. That was around the time that Kaddish came out that he was arrested. It was seized by the San Francisco police. But it was for Howell, not Kaddish.
Okay.
It was contemporaneous. The arrest was. It wasn't. He was not arrested. The books were seized by the police, so it had to do whether he could publish them. He may have been arrested. I'm not sure. But it's considered his most literary poem, his biggest masterpiece, but it's always kind of, a distant second to Howl. As to how it was received very well in literary circles, although there was some dissent. There was in the New York Times, which its opinions matter. There was a very cruel review by James Dickey. He's the author of Deliverance. I don't know if. Do you want me to read some?
Sure, please.
And this was by some of the literary establishment, sort of the general appraisal of the beatniks. They were not liked by everybody. It is fun to imagine the exhilaration that must seize people, quote, who always thought they might be poets when they try the Allen Ginsberg method to find out that, after all, they are poets. In each case, the needed equipment is very simple: of life with its memories, frustrations, secret wishes, very important these, and the ability to write elementary prose and to supply it with rather more exclamation points than might normally be called for. These show transport, awe, horror, and other important emotions. Later, refinements may be introduced, such as Zen Buddhism and the frequent use of words like strange, mad, tragic, visionary, angelic, apocalyptic, and lo, the neophyte is revealed as a full-blown Ginsbergian or beatnik poet, qualified to read in coffee houses, wear a beard, and serve as a quote-unquote living symbol of protest and freedom. Mr. Ginsberg's new poems in Kaddish, like his old poems, seem not so much themselves as a convenient prototype of all such writing. A strewn mishmash prose consisting mainly of assertions that its author is possessed, is often, if not always, in, quote, holy ecstasy, and so on. But the writing belies all such claims quite heartlessly. There is nothing holy about it in any sense that I can understand, and its obsession is evidenced only by its efforts to be so. Confession is not enough, and neither is the assumption of that truth of one's experience. And neither is the assumption that the truth of one's experience will emerge if only one can keep talking long enough in a whipped-up state of excitement. It takes more than that to make poetry. It just does. And he was, if you read the biographies, he was not so much hurt, he's just very scornful. He said, I figured they would say that. But reviews like that are often the best thing that ever happened to a poet. That's probably the second best thing that happened. The first best thing was having the poetry seized by the police, basically creates a controversy. And, which eventually it became a movie 10 years ago with James Ham, with John Hamm and James Franco, actually.
So that review made everybody want to go out and read it.
Well, it was the New York Times. Well, I don't know what it was. Maybe not the New York Times. Yeah, well, Well, it probably angered people who were his fans, and of course they went out and read it. So, yeah.
True. We're going to start winding things down. Is there anything further you'd like to say about your grandmother and her mental health, hospitalizations, anything like that? Although you said the family didn't talk about it, do you feel that was sort of an unspoken, one of many undercurrents or themes in your family?
Well, to the extent that it, dominated my uncle's life, and it was his biggest poem, and we would go to readings where, I would hear this. At the time, though, I was, between, 5, 10, and 15, and I'd sit through these readings, and it wasn't my kind of poetry. It didn't rhyme. There wasn't any animals in it. Except humans who were tormented. It obviously, my father was affected by it, and his poetry was affected by it. Although his poems do rhyme, it's it's the same sort of somewhat depressing themes. Although some of it, I guess, is joyous as well. But in my life, I actually didn't have much of a perception of what she was like at all, of course, because my grandmother is Edith. It wasn't Naomi, and I didn't really become interested in it until, even aware of it, I think, until I went to college, and even then I was busy with that and later law. And it's only I became very interested in my genealogy about 12 years ago, and I put together the family tree, and I've become increasingly more interested since then, which is part of the reason I agreed to this interview.
And what do you do professionally?
I'm an attorney in Manhattan. It's with the court system. It's drafting decisions for judges in complex commercial litigation. It's very far afield from what my uncle did, although he also intended, like my father, to become a lawyer, in particular a labor lawyer. But I remember him talking about this at one Thanksgiving or Christmas, that he came to the realization that it was all run by organized crime, which I guess he realized sometime in the early 40s and 50s when you had, there were issues with the Teamsters and other unions. So I can't imagine him doing anything. But I can't imagine him marketing toothpaste, but he did that for a couple of years.
Well, he could have been another William Kunstler.
Yeah,
I could see him doing that.
He could be represented. He was actually represented by William Kunstler in the in the Chicago 8 trial.
Yeah,
He was the witness on the stand, and he did his meditation of that. But he also marketed toothpaste. He would tell me that people would come up to him 20 years later and say, "Oh, you're still selling toothpaste." People who didn't realize his fame.
Okay, one last question. You answered it a little bit. Why did you want to be part of this oral history project?
Well, I think it's important, particularly when I was reading through these biographies and seeing the different perceptions people have when they interview different people, and so much of history is lost if you're not talking to the people who are somehow, if only tangentially like me, involved with it. And there's always a scrap of information you get that fill in the pieces. And as I've gotten older, I've become more interested in where I came from. You're not interested in that so much as a kid. You're just there, and your family's your family.
Well, I'm certainly impressed by the wealth of your information, bookshelves upon bookshelves of books. And
that's what Amazon is for.
Well, I know, but before this interview, you were showing us the famous John Avedon extended picture of your family.
Richard
Yes.
John Avedon was sort of the Eugene
son.
Brooks of the Avedon family.
Okay.
Lesser known.
All right, and then a letter Jack Kerouac wrote to your father.
Yes, when he was representing him in the paternity suit, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, my father handled most of both my uncles and Kerouac's literary affairs to some extent. They also had agents, but they would consult with my father before, and there's quite a bit of correspondence about that. But I think his first run-in with Kerouac is when they were caught with a truck. This is also in a lot of biographies, with a car full of stolen merchandise in Queens in the late 40s, and my father bailed them out. And later he represented Kerouac in the paternity suit by his first wife, but also in some of his literary affairs.
Well, thank you very much for your time and expertise. I appreciate it.
Thank you for this interview.
Excerpts from the poem Kaddish by Allen Ginsberg, dedicated to his mother, Naomi Ginsberg. Strange now to think of you, gone without corsets and eyes, while I walk on the sunny pavement of Greenwich Village. Downtown Manhattan, clear winter noon, and I've been up all night talking, reading the Kaddish aloud. Listening to Ray Charles Blue shout blind on the phonograph. The rhythm. And your memory in my head 3 years after. And you're out. Death let you out. Death had the mercy. You're done with your century, done with God, done with the path through it, done with yourself at last. Pure. Back to the babe dark before your father, before us all, before the world. There, rest. No more suffering for you. I know where you've gone. It's good. Over and over, refrain of the hospitals. Still haven't written your history. Leave it abstract. A few images run through the mind. like a saxophone chorus of houses and years, remembrance of electrical shocks. First nervous breakdown was 1919. She stayed home from school and lay in a dark room for 3 weeks. Something bad. Never said what. Every noise hurt. Dreams of the creaks of Wall Street. Phone calls to Dr. What's-It. She needs a rest. The mental hospital. State Greystone doctors. Bring her here, Mr. Ginsberg. Naomi. Sweating. Bulge-eyed. Fat. The dress unbuttoned at one side. Hair over brow. Her stockings hanging evilly on her legs. Screaming for a blood transfusion. One righteous hand upraised. A shoe in it. Barefoot in the pharmacy. Till the hired $35 ambulance came from Red Bank, grabbed her arms, strapped her on the stretcher, moaning, poisoned by imageries, vomiting chemicals through Jersey, begging mercy from Essex County to Morristown, and back to Greystone, where she lay 3 years. That was the last breakthrough. Delivered her to madhouse again. Oh, what wards I walked there later, oft. Old catonic ladies, gray as cloud or ash or walls, sit crooning over floor space, chairs, and the wrinkled hags a creep, accusing, begging my 13-year-old mercy. Take me home. I went alone sometimes, looking for the lost Naomi, taking stock. And I'd say, no, you're crazy, Mama. Trust the doctors. No love since Naomi screamed, since 1923. Now lost in Greystone Ward. New shock for her, electricity. Following the 40 insulin, and metrazole had made her fat. Blessed by you, Naomi, in hospitals. Blessed be you, Naomi, in solitude. Blessed be your triumph. Blessed be your bars. Blessed be your last years' loneliness.